Okay, great. Okay, good morning, and thank all of you for breaking off your breakfasts and doing whatever you're doing to prepare for the day and to come participate in our panel. Very excited to be able to share results from Ocean Exploration 2020 with you. My name is David McKinney. I'm with the Office of Ocean Exploration Research at NOAA, and I'll introduce the panelists in a moment. A couple of words of introduction to set the stage, and then I'll be asking the panelists a series of questions to spark a discussion, and then would like to engage you in that dialogue as well. So this is the sum total of the PowerPoint presentation you're going to see today from us. But we do have a beautiful report we'll talk about in a moment that because you're here and because we're one of the few panels actually offering door prizes, you get to have one to take with you. Okay, so a couple of words of introduction. Many of you probably know that NOAA's Ocean Exploration Program has been around since about 2001, and it was formed in response to what we call the President's Panel Report of 2000. Marcia McNutt, now editor-in-chief of Science Magazine and formerly USGS director and director of MBARI before that, was the chair of that panel and articulated a very compelling vision, we think, for a national ocean exploration program. In response, NOAA established our office back then, and since we've built what we think is a robust program of ocean exploration from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, but working always in partnership with other federal agencies, the academic world, and others to conduct our expeditions. Falling short, though, from a truly national program that the President's Panel report recommended back in 2000 for a variety of reasons, many of which you could predict, like not getting $100 million a year, for example. That said, we think we've gotten a lot done with the budget we do have and the partners we have. And we asked an independent review to come take a look at us to provide a 10-year look at how we've done and where we might go in the future, especially where we might go in the future. That independent review reported out last May, actually met last May and reported out a few months ago. And one of the strong recommendations was that we hold a national forum on ocean exploration. And the idea was to convene all the stakeholders, and by all the stakeholders in ocean exploration we mean naturally federal agencies, but also academic institutions, not-for-profit organizations, the private sector, and anyone else who viewed themselves as being interested in ocean exploration or being a potential ocean explorer. And so thanks to the foresight and wisdom of Jerry Schubel, I'll introduce him in a moment, but he's the president and CEO of the Aquarium of the Pacific. NOAA and the Aquarium of the Pacific were able to co-host Ocean Exploration 2020 in July of this year at the aquarium in Long Beach. And the premise here, the 2020, was to ask the community of ocean explorers to define elements of a national program as it should be in 2020. So not worrying about next year's appropriation or whether the Congress is going to shut down the federal government next week or any of those kinds of things. You know, where do we really need to be as a nation in ocean exploration? And we talked about 7 themes, and we'll get into those in a bit, but starting with ocean exploration priorities, partnerships and the nature of those partnerships, platforms, ships, AUVs, ROVs, technology development, interestingly, citizen exploration, and we'll talk about that quite a bit, data sharing and public engagement were the themes that we asked our community of ocean explorers to develop for us. Everybody on the panel was a leader, very active in Ocean Exploration 2020, and we're delighted to have them here. Where we'll go, we'll talk about in a moment, where we'll go with this report and its recommendations. But we think it was an event that is on par with the President's Panel report in 2000, where we think that the time is right to think about a network of stakeholders as opposed to a top-down driven program of national ocean exploration, and a collegial collaborative approach reflecting the way science is done these days and reflecting the realities of how we can and should work in the modern world. And so we're very excited to share these results with you. This is the report was released yesterday, If you look in certain places, you'll find some pretty good news articles about it. And so you're the first to find out about this report and to share with us your thoughts about what the panelists say and where we should go, as well as to help us move forward into the future. So with that, I'd like to introduce the panel, and starting at the far end, my partner in crime in Ocean Exploration 2020 is Dr. Jerry Schubel. Jerry, as I mentioned, is president and CEO of the Aquarium of the Pacific, and before that at the New England Aquarium. But perhaps most importantly to NOAA, he's a member of our Science Advisory Board, high-level group that provides, as you might expect from the title, science advice and policy direction in those areas to NOAA, and has been, even more importantly, a good friend to our agency, thoughtful, insightful, and helpful in all ways. And his partnership on Ocean Exploration 2020 is perhaps the best example of that. Next to him is Dr. Chris German from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. Chris facilitated an online version of Ocean Exploration 2020. Not everyone could be there in person, and so we had using Google Hangouts, we had a chance for a virtual panel with virtual participants, and Chris was kind enough to lead that. And I think in the process learned a great deal about citizen exploration, and I'm sure he'll comment on that. But Chris is has been involved in more than 50 expeditions around the world, and is a very important player in the ocean exploration community. Next is Dr. Rick Spinrad, who's Vice President for Research at Oregon State University, and much more importantly than that, my former boss. So delighted to... right. So Rick was a moderator and presenter at Ocean Exploration 2020, and as you know, because he's about to, you're becoming the president of MTS, you're very active in your community, as well as directing research at Oregon State. And then finally, Eric Stackpole with OpenROV, and Eric is the engineer who devised this little robot that he'll talk about. We had a chance to meet at a sort of informal dinner in Silicon Valley at Rainbow Mansion a couple of years ago, and we sat next to each other just like this, and I heard the story, and I just come back from work in Indonesia and told Eric that I had to get you to, I've got to take you to Indonesia with your robot. And one thing led to another, and we haven't gone to Indonesia yet, but we will. But Eric and his co-founder of OpenROV, David Lang, played a very important role in educating all of us about the importance of citizen exploration. So with that, panelists, did I miss anything important about your backgrounds or the context? Okay, great. So as not to flog you with PowerPoints, I mentioned before we'll do a discussion format. And I'd like to start with a question for each panelist in turn. And I think it's important to define our terms, because even the community of about 110 ocean explorers in Long Beach struggled at times with the question, what is exploration anyway, and how does it differ from research? So Jerry, I'd like to start, and if we could use the microphone, because we are webcast around the world. Everyone is watching right now.
Okay, so how does exploration differ from research? There's not a bright red line that we like to talk about these days. It's a spectrum, and I think most of us at the forum agree that it's an early stage of research. And while in research you're going out to test a hypothesis or to answer a question, when you're going out to explore, you're less confined by that. And there's something very important. One time in my career, I spent a year in graduate school to become a psychologist. And there's a very important experiment that was done a number of years ago, where psychologists filmed 6 students passing a basketball back and forth. And they showed this to lots of graduate students and undergraduates around the country. And the challenge for them was count the number of times the basketball was passed. And halfway through the filming of the video, a person dressed in a gorilla suit walked across the stage, paused long enough to beat his chest, and walked off. And they asked then the students, not only how many times was the basketball passed, how many of you saw the gorilla? When they did this at Harvard, only 50% of the students ever saw the gorilla. Now, you could argue that was Harvard and it was some other university, you know. But nationwide, it was about half. And I think, for me, that defines the distinction to a large measure between exploration and research. If you're going out to do research, you're so focused on answering a question, testing a hypothesis, you often miss some of the things that explorers will see. And now, that doesn't mean that explorers don't go out prepared. They do. And if you remember Pasteur's comment that discovery favors the prepared mind, but it's prepared in quite a different way. So I would say it's an early stage of research, not constrained by testing a specific hypothesis.
That's great. And every time I spend time with Jerry, I learn something new, like that he was a graduate student in psychology. I didn't know that, much less hear the gorilla suit analogy. Chris, as an ocean explorer and distinguished scientist, probably focus more on research in much of your career than exploration. What do you think?
I think Jerry pretty much had it right, that they aren't two different things. They're basically either end of a spectrum. There's a grayscale of these things that, and my experience over the years of going out to sea, where about half of what I do is probably considered more exploratory than process-oriented research. Because there's so much ocean out there, trying to pick where to start means that you actually make value judgments. So you already have the, basic hypotheses, but they're very broad hypotheses of, there's a reason why you choose a particular place that you want to go to. You have a question of, I wonder what's happening here because of something else you already know. So even the first explorations we do doesn't go out in a complete vacuum. It's not completely, wow, let's just go look at somewhere we've never looked at before. Let's say, so why are you going to go there? There was something with the Mid-Ocean Ridge program in the 1990s, was, well, there are lots of places in the world I need to go, but there's a good reason why we need to start in the Southwest Indian Ocean. And we could actually pick that and explain that's why that was the right place to start. But the flip side of it is that when you're doing exploration is that you end up generating new kinds of hypotheses, so that exploration tends to be informed by research in the first place. The prior research informs where would you start your next dose of exploration, because we know we don't have 100 million a year. So over my career, I have to actually work out, okay, I can probably only do 10% of all the things that would be interesting, which would be the most valuable 10% that give the biggest return for the buck. And then the flip side is when you go out, the most exciting days are the days when things don't fit your prejudices. And if you went out on a cruise and everything you found out was exactly what you expected to find out, that would be about the dullest. At that point we could stop doing oceanography because we know everything, right? And the flip side is when you actually find things you weren't expecting, that opens up new questions. So that's actually happened to me even since the Ocean Exploration 2020 meeting in July, that we actually have gone out, found new kinds of fluid flow on the seafloor we hadn't seen before, and now we're interested in, well, I wonder what the significance of that is. And we don't know because we've looked at it. We haven't made any measurements because we were exploring. We weren't geared up to do a process study on a system we'd never seen before. But we know exactly where to go back and actually answer those questions. Now we can now come up with focused questions that we couldn't have had a month ago.
That's great. And the other thing about Dr. Spinrad I should have mentioned is that he's could be considered the architect of our current program in NOAA. It was under his watch that we had our major growth years. So that a little additional context for you, Rick. But
thanks, Dave.
And your thoughts about the question.
So I'd expand on what I think we heard in terms of concurrence from Chris and Jerry, that exploration is observation without hypothesis to a certain extent. And I'm also going to add in the end of my comment here that I believe exploration is denial of arrogance. And I'll come to that in a minute. So the observation without hypothesis, you heard really eloquent characterizations of that from both Chris and Jerry. I would simply add that the observational piece is many-faceted. So the tendency is to think of the visual component of that. But the really fascinating part of observation in the sea is that it involves not just looking, but smelling, tasting, feeling. And that, of course, invokes exploration in how we actually explore. What are the new sensor technologies? How accurate, how highly resolved do you need to smell, taste, feel the environment? The denial of arrogance part, I was thinking about this in the sense that if you went back 125 years We firmly believed and were convinced that there was no life in the benthic ocean at the bottom of the ocean in the middle of the basins. That was clearly refuted not too soon after that with work of the Challenger expedition, for example. You go back about 100 years and people felt, well, clearly there's no life in the polar environments. Ross and others clearly refuted that. You go back 30 or 40 years, we believe there's absolutely no way that any life could exist in these extremely aggressive environments of deep sea vents where the chemistry and temperature and pressure are so extraordinary, and we've now discovered that that's not true. When I was a grad student, we, to put this in more than just the biological context, we never heard of La Nina, which tells you how old I am. We never heard of La Nina, and we firmly believe that El Nino was specifically every 7 years, like clockwork. We now know these are not true. Are we so arrogant as to believe that we've characterized all of the problems? And I would argue, if we are that arrogant, we need to deny that with more explanation, because all of our common understanding can probably be refuted by observing without hypothesis.
Great. Thanks, Rick. And Eric, clean up.
Yeah, thank you. Well, these guys all have very good perspectives, and it's always interesting for me to hear kind of perspectives from people who are really very familiar with the field of research as well as exploration. And I'm kind of a noob. I'm interested in exploration because of something that I think goes beyond just people who are in the field. Exploration is something that's innate. There's something built into just human nature that makes us curious about the world. Exploration is the reason we climb over that mountain or flip that rock to see what's under it. And I guess you could say that research is kind of a pursuit of going further into the realm of things that we know. We know about something, we want to research to know more. Exploration is kind of diving into the realm of the things that we don't know. We are curious, we have no idea what to expect, and we want this thing that's completely unknown to be, I guess, understood for the first time. But it's that human element of exploration that I think really is what drives a lot of research as well. Although we may justify things by saying, you know, this is important for understanding if climate change, how significant climate change issues are. This is important for understanding how a certain species reproduces, which will expand our body of knowledge about that. I'll bet you that a lot of the research grants that go out there also happened because someone was just genuinely interested in it for no other reason. An example I like to use quite often when talking about OpenROV and, you know, this kind of low-cost vehicle that allows you to explore underwater is you don't have to convince kids to play video games. You don't. They just innately want to do it. And why is that? And I actually did this kind of as an exercise for fun once. I went onto an online forum that had, you know, tweens and teens talking about their favorite video games and why they like to play them. And there were kind of three big themes that I came up with for the reasons why people like to do this. One is exploration. They like exploring a distant world, a place that they've never been before. Two is they like getting progressively better at something, you know, the kind of leveling up thing. And I think that that's very obviously applicable to the science realm too. You like kind of getting to the next level and diving in one level more and knowing a different things at a finer resolution. And then the last one was interacting with people, which is maybe a little bit abstract for the science world, but if you look at it, we're all kind of one world, and we all live, you know, with this same network of oceans. And we're trying to relate to each other because the way the Earth works is something that we all have in common. So I think exploration really has a lot to do also with this kind of human element, which is often hidden from you know, the text of a research grant and things like that. And I think that's a really important part to consider when looking at what exploration really is.
Great. Excellent. Thanks to you all. I think that helps set the stage and reflects some of the different perspectives that participants brought to the National Forum as well. On the one hand, you had the kinds of things that Eric was talking about, and you know, it's true. Most of my education came from National Geographic magazine. Growing up, school certainly wasn't much of a part of that, but it was the articles on ocean exploration that have a lot to do with why I do what I do for a living now. And it wasn't because I was a scientist. I just thought it was really cool. all the way to the more policy-oriented participants who worried about phraseology. You know, if you want to sell something to BOEM, it has to be put this way. If you want to sell it to NOAA, it has to be put that way. But all these people coming together to think about what it means to explore and what it means to have a national ocean exploration program that was credible and could advance the national interest in ocean exploration. So with that in mind, let me ask one more sort of broad question before we dive into the contents of the report itself. And that's I had a professor in undergraduate school who, you know, the worst comment you could get on your paper was, "So what?" question mark. I got a few of those. But so what? What does it mean to the nation and literally the world? The ocean doesn't stop at the US EEZ, despite the views of some. So why? Why is it important? Not just from a science perspective, but look more broadly. And I'll flip it around and start with you.
So I guess dive in a little more specifically, like so what? Why does it matter to us? Okay, well, I guess I can actually use what I was talking about before. There's this so what of, you know, okay, well, how is this going to affect the policy, you know? I think definitely, like right now, probably the most predominant thing you see, especially in ocean research, but all these kind of sciences, is a lot of stuff about climate change. And that's a very obvious so what. There's things we need to do. We need to know where to look and what things we need to, affect. But there's a so what also relating to the human experience. I think that if you look at most people who kind of retrospectively are viewing all the things that humans have accomplished, and you ask them what are the biggest accomplishments of mankind, the moon landing is probably up there, right? And it's not because of what we learned about, you know, the type of rock that's there. It's not about what we, it's not really even about the political stuff. It's not about beating the Russians. I think most people are completely fascinated that we as a human race were able to do something that was really profound and go to some place that previously had been only a thing that humans had dreamed of. I mean, how long have we seen that moon in the sky? Since before there was language, I'm sure, and wondered what it's like there. So when you look at what we pursue as a nation, or what even, you know, the world's governments pursue, I think addressing something that really kind of pushes the bounds of what we as humankind can do really kind of shapes the way that we look at ourselves and the kind of way that we assume we can work as a species. So that's kind of a quick answer to that, I think.
That's good. So turn it over to Rick, and I would ask you, Rick, to pick up on one theme as you think about the national interest that Eric laid out, and that is actually very important to you, given how far out on a limb you went with Index Satell, the connection between people in exploration as well as, and so our international interests as well as our national interests.
So I'll come at that, the value proposition, if you will, from perspective of health. That's just one example, and national security. Mm-hmm. Two very disparate and different approaches, which I think of and by themselves have value to everyone. And if you think about the health issue, I've got to tell you a very quick story. When I was at NOAA, one of my jobs, not the more pleasant part of the job, was briefing members of Congress on why we had programs like this. And I had the dubious honor of approaching a member of Congress who was positioned to be the chair of the Science Committee on the House of Representatives. And I walked into his office and he said to me, "I just want you to know I don't really care about science," which was kind of a disturbing proposition. But I realized right then that if I was going to make any treadway with this important and powerful member of Congress, I was going to have to argue the value proposition. Not that I thought it was really cool to be able to derive the equations of fluid motion, but we started in a discussion, and I asked him, I said, "Do you have anybody in your family who's suffered from cancer?" And unfortunately, that's a safe bet these days. Almost everybody, I suspect, here in the room can answer yes. And then I shared with him that half of the anti-cancer drug discoveries, half of them, come from marine organisms or marine products. But the problem, if you ask one of our colleagues, preeminent explorer Shirley Pomponi, for example, is that it's difficult. You can't simply just say, I'm going to go here and get this particular organism that has these unique genetic characteristics. You really do need to be able to explore for different kinds of organisms that thrive in different kinds of environments. And so you can make that connection with something as valuable as the health application pretty easily. The other argument I would say, I'd use a national security example. And now I'm going to go back to my experiences managing programs at the Office of Naval Research a quarter century ago, where one of the very first researchers I met was a guy named Bob Ballard, who was sponsored by the Navy to do some incredible things. Most people in the world, in this country, know Dr. Ballard as a preeminent ocean explorer. He could not have done what he was doing for the United States Navy without development of extraordinary tools and capabilities, which were primarily in the service of our national security interests. And yet he is known primarily as a preeminent explorer. So there's two real examples of the value proposition that couldn't be addressed without engaging in a pretty active exploration effort.
Mm-hmm. Good. And did you want to comment on the Indonesia?
Yeah, so to bring it back, so the discussion with our colleagues in Indonesia a few years ago about the value of going to explore in their waters was not predicated on what we as U.S. partners would get out of this per se, but the potential good and the potential understanding of resources of new knowledge associated with their unique environment, and that they, through their EEZ, had understanding embedded in the Ban de Sea, for example, that would probably ultimately help with issues like health solutions for the world. Mm-hmm. And it could position the Indonesians in a very important position with respect to supporting some global problems. Mm-hmm. And that, if I can just add one other point, that was not an easy issue to address, because what they saw was a first world nation coming in with interest in their resources. And we had to convey that this was not about coming to be an extractive technology, but really about
even as a diplomatic element of the relationship. Yeah, great. Chris.
I guess my answer to the question of the so what or the why bother would be much more on more abstract on the level of like planetary stewardship. That we know more than half our planet lies under more than 2 miles of ocean water. So those of us in this room who breathe gases and live on dry land, we're the freaks, we're the weird things. It's this whole idea of like, why go and do something so weird and strange as go look in the ocean? That's normal. If there's a plot I gave at the meeting in July, that you can play this at home on Google Earth. If you actually position yourself somewhere between Tahiti and Hawaii, and you zoom out on the planet, you could basically imagine if you were coming from space and you came at the right angle, you could arrive at the Earth and not see any land at all. You know, it's entirely ocean. You can just about see a little bit of New Zealand if you really squint in one corner, and Baja California in the other, and nothing in between. It's entirely deep ocean. And that's before you imagine that you factor in the if you factor in the Atlantic, Indian, Arctic and Antarctic oceans. That's just the Pacific Ocean. Just covers that much up. And humans don't deal with that very well. If you go and look at the same thing on Wikipedia, the Earth gets distorted so you can see the land around it and makes the Pacific look small because it's a bit scary otherwise for those of us who do live on land. So we know it takes up most of the planet. We know that the actual volume of the ocean provides the largest contiguous ecosystem for life on our planet, and we know it regulates the climate for everybody who lives on land as well. So how is it okay not to know more about it? I mean, I think, so I'd like turn it the other way around of like, you know, how can you not think this is an important thing that we should be doing, and why hasn't it been done yet?
That's great, thank you. And Jerry?
Okay, without repeating very much of what has been said, which I agree with, I would add to that national pride is one thing that I think is important. We were founded as a maritime nation. We were a leading maritime state for many, throughout most of our history. You could argue that we are no longer a leading maritime state if you look at many of the metrics of who builds the ships, go into any one of our big ports, which of these are ships carry U.S. flags. You look at the age of the merchant marine, et cetera. So there's national pride. And I want to add to what was said about Indonesia. The two largest democracies on planet Earth with very different Judeo-Christian background in one case, very different approaches, and I think ocean exploration can bring nations and peoples together in ways that many things cannot. And I would just reinforce also what Chris said. I think if Sylvia Earle were here, she would say that the ocean is the largest single component of Earth's living infrastructure, and which is Earth's life support system. And it's clear from the Census of Marine Life that we are changing the ocean in ways that we never would have thought possible a decade or two ago, and we're changing them more rapidly. And in many of these cases, there's so much inertia in some of these changes that we simply have to act. So it's a combination, I think, of all of the things that we've said. And so to me, how could the world's leading nation not have a major program in ocean exploration? And I think that the report gives us something to run with. And the question is, will we take this opportunity? We're in the red zone. Are we going to score a touchdown or kick a field goal, or what are we going to do?
We prefer hockey analogies, Jerry. Okay. Great, thanks. Well, speaking of the report, I'd like to suggest we turn now to the major themes. And we got some results that I think were I won't say predictable, but sort of expected in getting this community of ocean explorers together. But some results that were surprising. And so I think where we should start, when you get copies, you'll see that we've got these themes laid out, and there's commentary on each themes, but also, and this was Jerry's great idea, we did a survey of invitees in advance, and we asked them their views on these different themes, and that helped jumpstart the discussion at the forum in Long Beach. And it's interesting that in the end, after a lot of discussion and a lot of rich interaction, the survey results were clarified and codified, but not changed so much, which was an interesting result from the forum itself. But let's start with ocean exploration priorities. I think a number of us would have said that, well, the highest priority is the U.S. EEZ. We need to know more about that 200 miles offshore and really get a good understanding of what's there. That was not the answer that the forum participants provided. So Chris, I'd like to ask you to share your thoughts about the results we did get. In particular, we had the Arctic as the highest priority, emphatically the highest priority, followed closely by both polar regions. We also had a question about process and a view that ocean acidification was a process and a phenomenon that needed to be explored. So what was your take on the discussion here and the not only the priorities, but how we get those priorities?
Well, I think you hit on a great point to start with. A national program should also include international leadership. Mm-hmm. So that's why, I mean, your EEZ comment is great. I remember when Ballard was on this Colbert report a couple of years ago. The best soundbite I've heard about this so far is half of America is underwater, mm-hmm. which is true. You can actually map out the surface area of territory that belongs to the United States. We have as much territory subsurface as there is on land. But I think the national leadership thing is an important thing, going back to what Jerry was saying, and kind of echoes back to the first comment I made this morning of if you're going to go exploring, you have to choose priorities of where you should go. Mm-hmm. There has to be a reason why you want to go somewhere. And a large part of it for me is in terms of the geographic answer, becomes down to places that are either unperturbed or are rapidly evolving. So it's not just there's a lot out there, but time is of the essence as well. And so the Arctic is the most visible of the lot. I mean, I know we've just passed the minimum sea ice for this year, and it wasn't as dramatic as last year's lowest ever ice cover in the Arctic, but the trend is clearly going in a bad direction. The Arctic ice is receding, so trying to understand that system and exactly what the implications are going to be, time is running out. So it's kind of a no-brainer that we need to go and study that sooner rather than later. Mm-hmm. That one can't wait. Another one from geography that I think is also important, though, that wasn't mentioned in your remarks there, but it's in the report, is the Central Pacific. And that's something that, if you imagine, in this audience we have a pretty well-educated audience, know what the thermohaline conveyor is, this large conveyor belt by which deep ocean circulation or deep ocean currents form at the poles, deep water sinks and trundles around the world's ocean. And basically the far end of that is the Central Pacific. So it's the deep water that's probably the best chance we've got of understanding the pristine, unperturbed ocean, dating back millennia, so faster than industrial impacts and things like that. The place that's least likely to be perturbed already is in the Pacific, but time's running out on that. The clock's ticking of, we know, for example, we can see refrigerants have extended all the way down through the Atlantic. We can see where bomb testing radiocarbon has penetrated through the Atlantic Ocean. The idea we could go and study anywhere in the Atlantic that's pristine is pretty gone now. We can't do that. The Pacific's, somewhere we'd have some hope. Clearly there's atmospheric interaction on the surface, but at depth there's scope there. Again, there were processes. There was actually the ocean acidification that you've mentioned as well. The other one I think that's particularly important that I'm intrigued in and we're finding out a lot more about is different ways that methane might be being released into the deep ocean. So we know methane in the atmosphere is a really potent greenhouse gas, is it? I think more than 10 times, I think 16 times more powerful, more intense than carbon dioxide. But just in the last few years, including work that we've been doing within the US EEZ, I think there's more than 100 different sites now where we think there's methane actively bubbling from the seafloor. And a year ago, we knew of 1 or 2 sites like that. So there's whole processes that, again, things we've discovered through exploration, and now we have to sit and go, so what's happening to all that methane? What are the processes? So it's another example of how there's a whole bunch of hypothesis testing research can now evolve out of something where if we hadn't actually gone and made the maps, we'd never have found that stuff. And I did want to make sure I got all the answers in here. And then I think then there's somewhere halfway between there's processes, then there's geographic locations of where on the map would you go, and then there's conceptually what are systems that we don't understand yet. One of them is deep ocean trenches, as in the report, and it was something that was really painful to us at the end of the Census of Marine Life. We had a decade of the Census of Marine Life trying to go out and understand what lives where in the world's oceans. And basically because at the time we were still technology limited, we had to come to the end of the Census of Marine Life decade in 2010 and still realize we hadn't really made many advances at all in understanding what lives in the bottom of deep ocean trenches. Half of the world's plate tectonics we've understood in our generation is a major driving process for how the Earth works as a system. And we've been able to study one end of that cycle with mid-ocean ridges very thoroughly. And the other stuff still remains pretty unknown. We've been able to do remote sensing, mapping from sonars from ships, and if we did that at mid-ocean ridges and nothing else, we wouldn't know about hydrothermal vents and all the wonderful life that lives there. So it's going to be a fantastic thing, in the next, that's one of the big visions, I think, for the next decade, is to understand that. And then the other one, sorry, I've talked a long time, but the other one is just the ocean interior. We've been great with ships throughout history, the last couple of 100 years of driving around, traversing the surface of the planet, understanding what's happening at the ASA interface where ships go. We've got very good at actually building robotic systems that go down and study the seafloor. And then there's that huge volume in between. That's right. Where we have the lights turned off and we're not looking. And that's probably where huge amounts of the life is. I think it's one of those things people have talked about with gelatinous organisms, are things that when people just used fishing nets to fish, they didn't know these things existed because they didn't get sampled. It's only by actually having vehicles traversing up and down through these systems you suddenly go, wow, what is all this other life doing? Because it just never got noticed. So that's a long answer to a short question.
Oh, that's good. I'd like to invite any other panelists to comment and also about how we get these priorities. How should we get the
I would just add, I think one can have multiple priorities, and part of the trick is to connect the dots. And I think if you look at ocean acidification in polar regions, it is in the polar regions, probably more in the Antarctic than the Arctic, where the bulk of the CO2 enters the ocean. So if we're clever enough, we can look at these and pursue more than one priority. And I think on the water column, greater emphasis there is also very important.
Go ahead, please.
So 2 comments. I think my cynicism is going to show here a little bit, and I'm going to come back to my arrogance comment. So
it's a good combination.
Yeah, cynicism and arrogance, right? Well, I spent too much time at DC, I guess. The cynicism part comes in that when you look at the report, you see that there are geographic areas and ocean features and processes identified. And then there's a parenthetical in rank order statement, and the cynicism part comes from the standpoint that people who have to make decisions use these kinds of things not to say, oh, we must go to the Arctic, we've got to study the water column, we really need to focus on ocean acidification, which are identified as the tops in those, but they tend to say, oh, so the US EEZ is at the bottom of the list. Great, we don't have to do that. And that's the concern I've got with the sort of rank ordering approach. The arrogance part comes in, it really feeds off Chris's comment, and that is that I think about some of the things that we've just learned about especially the EEZ, and I was going to use the methane hydrants example as one. I would also point out that off our coast in Oregon, we're learning incredible things about hypoxia onset and the variations in coastal upwelling. And the point is that even without a hypothesis, I still believe it's somewhat arrogant to say, hey, look, we got these great charts and images from the EEZ, so that's really not a high priority. We've pretty much got it known. We understand all the things that are observable there. I think that's off the mark. There's a great piece in this report by none other than Walter Munk, who says, we don't really understand wind drag on the ocean. Are you kidding me? Wind drag. And if Walter says it, it's true. So you talk about processes. Yes, ocean acidification is clearly a high priority. We need to be careful to not select our favorite of all of our children. And I realize at some point resources have to be applied towards problems, but I think we need to keep our scope wide open. And when you've got somebody like Walter Munk saying that wind drag, as fundamental a process as wind drag, is right up there, we ought to think, well, how does that relate to not understanding ocean acidification? There's a Rumsfeldian argument here, and that is it's the unknown that we don't know about that we want to focus on here. That should be the highest priority.
Great. Walter Munk, Donald Rumsfeld, it's all, all ties together. Eric, anything to add? Would you like to?
Yeah, just very briefly. Yeah, I mean, I think you touched on one big issue, which is that, when you say what are the most important things to look at, that naturally kind of makes people have this perspective of a priority, and then they don't just look at what's on the top, they look at what's on the bottom and assume that that's not a priority. And certainly, what Open ROV is all about is make it so you don't need a priority. You shouldn't take a research grant to do exploration, you should take curiosity. And so you should never have to prioritize and have that result in what gets looked at and what doesn't. You should try to just get more eyes out there. And just like new YouTube videos of weird phenomena happening around the world popping up, and that bringing the attention of more eyes, I think that's how exploration should happen too. We should look at the unknown, we should see what is most interesting to us, and go on. I think this list so far is the things that we've discovered are interesting to look at so far, but there's a lot more to be discovered that may even have a higher priority than what we know about so far.
I would add, I think the value of a national program, a network program, is that different organizations and different groups have different interests. So that's one way to cover it, or different capabilities. We have the Okeanos Explorer, but she's not going to the Arctic. So how can we partner with the Coast Guard, who does go to the Arctic, to focus on these priorities?
Can I just come back with one comment as well to build on what Rick was saying? Is he was worried about things appearing low or high in the rank order in this report. This is just the top A list of things that we're in a much longer long list. If they're in this report, they're already important. And these are really, and we were thinking not just at a national program, but at a national level with partnerships that can spread internationally. All of these things are things that the community think need to get started between now and 2020. So in the next 7 years, all of these things need to get up and running. And it's a bit like, if you go to the Oscar ceremony or you watch it on TV, these are like the Oscar nominations. Only one person can be top of the list and can win the Oscar. It doesn't make, it doesn't mean Meryl Streep was a bad actress last year, or, that something became a bad movie if it doesn't win the best movie Oscar. Mm-hmm. So I think, it's with a pinch of, these priorities, some of them are no-brainers like that, but the fact they're in this report, all of these things need to get done. They're already all important.
And as someone who synthesizes survey results, I can attest to Chris's comment that this is just the A list, and the actual list is many, many, many entries deep. So one comment before we move on to the next theme of partnerships, and that has to do with how we get the priorities. And since I do work in government and I do have to think about process once in a while, I think one outcome that was kind of interesting was that there was agreement of the folks who were at the forum that workshops or seminars to identify priorities was important, but but they also felt it wasn't enough, and that there were other mechanisms. We needed to be broader and more inclusive in identifying priorities and use other, whether it was social media tools or other venues to come up with priorities as a national program, so that all the stakeholders could see what was important across the board, and then pursue different priorities according to their interests and capabilities. Some good results there that are explained in more detail. So I'd like to move on to the next major theme of partnerships, and to some extent this is a no-brainer in today's networked world, but I'd like to start with a quote from Eric's colleague David Lang, who said in an article recently that he thinks the future of ocean exploration looks a lot less like an Apollo mission and a lot more like Wikipedia. And I wish he'd said that in time to put it in this report, but it's I think a great reflection of where we are, not just because of the opportunity and the technology and the way we think and work now, but also because of the reality of our constraints. No one entity is going to have the biggest checkbook like NASA used to for the Apollo missions and be able to underwrite ocean exploration nationally. It's going to be a whole bunch of partners. So with that introduction, Jerry, could you start us off on a discussion of partnerships and why they matter?
This was very clearly one of the strong areas of consensus. Partnerships do matter, and I think there are a broad range of partnerships, collaborations. Collaborations are tough, though, and I think so. We have to start with good collaborations. The partners each gain something from it. We all know that not all individuals and not all institutions are good collaborators, and not all explorers are good collaborators. So you start with the ones that are known to be good collaborators, that bring different strengths to the table, and that each will benefit from, and you go from there. And I don't know whether it's Wikipedia, but it certainly is going to be much more open, I think, than it has been in the past, if we're going to succeed, because the federal government, the prospects for funding are not that great in the next few years, and now is the time when we have a window of opportunity to move forward, and it will come through partnerships with the private commercial sector, with the NGO community, and others.
Mm-hmm. Great. Rick, would you like to follow up, or anyone else?
So I know we're going to talk a bit about citizen science, and I have a hard time separating this, and it really feeds off the comment Eric made, both here and also at the workshop. And I think of this in the context of, there's a really interesting piece of work that was done a few years ago called the fourth paradigm. And the argument is that we've gone through paradigms in science, the first being empirical, observing the stars the way Tycho Brahe did, and drawing conclusions from that. The second was theoretical, think Newton or Kepler, that they developed principles and derived conclusions. The third then was computational, and think of that in terms of weather forecast models. And then the fourth paradigm is the data-intensive paradigm, that we're just going to get volumes and volumes of information. So the big radio telescopes, the Large Hadron Collider. And I would argue that what we're talking about here in terms of partnerships is a fifth paradigm, and it's accessible science. So everything in these other four paradigms was kind of a closed court. You had to be part of that community. And so the partnerships piece here is really about the accessibility. How do you build a partnership so that you can collect information yourself or have access to, through telepresence and web-based concepts, that you have access to to information, not unlike the SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence concept. And so that's part of the citizen science. I think what we need to do is build on what the reports got in finding that really potent intersection of partnership concepts, which invokes all the public-private mechanisms that we need, and also the citizen science piece. Because I guarantee you there are people out there, with 6 billion of us on this planet, who've got some really clever perceptive techniques or really clever observational capabilities that we're not taking advantage of right now.
7.2 billion.
I'm sorry, 7.2. Working towards 9, right, thank you.
Actually, 411.
Add toward 11. There you go. It keeps going up.
Okay. Eric or Chris? Okay.
So I think that the whole thing with partnerships is you can't impose good collaborators or good collaborations. So that's where the national program and where this report becomes really an important thing, because it lays out a framework. And I think it scales at the level of, you know, here's a game plan. Here's the kind of stuff that needs to get done. And then the partnerships can work at different levels. I mean, at the level of geographic location, we're talking about, you know, you can't go everywhere at once. Well, maybe you can if you've got enough players. And not everybody can go, you know, the Arctic might be set out as the top-ranked priority geographically. Not everybody has a capability to go to the Arctic. But there's an awful lot of people that want to go out and explore other places. This, you know, that's part of this report. It lays out a framework of people can join in at whatever level they want to. And it's like the SETI one comes down, you know, that comes down to the level of the individual. So it's very much a matter of, you know, this lays out a strategy so it's coherent. Because otherwise, if people just said, hey, I want to go and get involved, and they just went off at random, then what they did may not actually be nearly as of as much value as if they're actually joining into this bigger strategy. They realize what they plug in, and it's what do you want to bring to the game, and how much have you got to offer, and what have you got to offer, which can then go from somebody with an icebreaker, or somebody with a robot that can go to the bottom of the world's ocean trenches, or somebody who's got a couple of hours to look through some video. And I think I'm going to hand this over to Eric almost immediately. I think that's where I want to go from. There was a conversation we were having earlier today, but it came up with I spent a lot of time on the Google Hangout sessions with David, Eric's counterpart at OpenROV, and we were very much focused on the concept of citizen explorer rather than citizen scientist, because not everybody can construct a hypothesis and write a science proposal, but everybody can observe shape and color and movement. And in exploration, that's like just knowing what you're seeing, the observation without hypothesis Rick was talking about earlier. We're all capable of that.
Before you pass that on, can I add a note? Because I want to come back to the point, the data-driven paradigm, and I agree with that, and now the accessible. And we're in the era of big data, but policymakers don't want data, managers don't want data, the public darn sure doesn't want data. They want information, and transforming data into information is the challenge that we have. And I think the best definition of the difference was by Medawar, who won the Nobel Prize. He's not long dead. Most of the people I know are dead. But he said, information is data that have been configured and architected to either deliver a message or answer a question. We've got to put more emphasis on transforming big data into information that the people who can use it and understand it will appreciate. We have in the audience a guy from Esri, Drew Stevens, who participated in this forum, and you know that maps are one very important way of transforming data into information to tell a story. And if we have time, I would like to come back at some of our informal science institutions that also, I think, play a role in that arena.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I think you guys have got it right. You know, just one bit that I think is kind of what we've all been saying here too about participation, is that it's not everyone who does everything and then another group that does everything and all these different groups that do everything kind of working together to do everything more. The whole point of participation is that you have someone whose expertise is one subject and that mends well with a different one. And specifically talking about something that's happening right now, and I'll go more into this when we talk about citizen exploration and kind of getting the community involved, is the MAKE movement, this kind of thing that's been happening now where with technology, everyday people are able to do things that used to require very large institutions. And I think that there's a huge potential right now for the blending of this kind of MAKE movement, this group of tinkerers and people who like to build things with the scientific community. I'm not a scientist. I don't know much about science. I kind of hear things and I repeat them, but I like to build things, and that's what I'm good at. And so, you know, using OpenROV as an example, what we're trying to do is make it so we have all these people, this big community of tinkerers who have ideas of how to build something or how to accomplish a goal, talking with people in the science realm, in academics or through government, and hearing from those people, hey, this is something that's really interesting, that's worth taking a look at, and combining those. I mean, it's the same way as if you had a project that you wanted to do with a friend. You know, if you have a friend who's good at working on cars and you want to make your car work better, you can invite them over, but maybe you're better at you have the tools. I mean, I think the way that we interact just with each other as individuals is the same way that large institutions can interact. And particularly when we're talking about kind of getting the gross public involved with this stuff, I think we have to appreciate that the gross public isn't going to be the ones who are doing the really number crunching type of science. They're going to be the ones who are the more eyes to look at the huge data sets, or the people who come up with different perspectives on how to approach a problem. And there's a huge potential there that we're just now beginning to really appreciate.
Great, please.
I'd like to make one more comment before we get off the partnerships piece and call to the attention of the audience that we have an extraordinary convergence of activities and events right now. And David alluded to this in start in terms of what's happening with federal funding. But we've got the need to develop partnerships with groups like Schmidt Ocean Institute, who are bringing considerable resources in the form of dollars, in the form of ships, in the form of expertise to the table. And at the same time, you've got this whole new kind of approach that Eric and David represent with regard to how do public, private, crowdsourced groups really invest in this. It's a different world. 10, 20 years from now, this room would have been filled with program managers from federal agencies. You can count the number of program managers from federal agencies at this conference on 2 hands, total. So we better be thinking about the sort of resourcing mechanism and the new partnerships that are needed. And we're going to have to revisit concepts for commingling public and private funds, which, oh, by the way, is illegal right now. But maybe we need to change some of that to allow a little bit more creativity.
Yeah, excellent point. Oh, please.
And just on that last one, I think that aspect of the partnership, the way things have evolved just in the last few years, that's where, again, having a coherent program is really important, because it provides both transparency and clarity of where we're going to go. And if you had private benefactors wanted to come in and said, hey, we want to go and do ocean exploration, and they went off and did it in splendid isolation, it might be a wonderful ego trip, but it wouldn't necessarily be constructive or useful. Whereas this actually, having a national program which actually says, okay, so we have a coherent focus here, we actually can set out an agenda that everybody signs up to, then explains again how you can actually plug into that system. So it was really encouraging that at the forum in July, we actually had representatives from the Schmidt Ocean Institute, from the Ocean Exploration Trust, actually participating and actively engaged in the debate, so that they can actually, be part of something bigger. And that's it, everybody then gets to win, because basically the leverage you come out of it, which is how, basically it's like, almost getting biblical, the parable of the talents, right? If we took this program and hid it under a bush and didn't share the information with everybody, our ocean exploration program for the next 7 years wouldn't be nearly as powerful as if we get it out there and spread it around and get the message out. That's my evangelizing for the day.
Very good point. So we have a couple of other topics to turn to before we ask for questions, and we don't really have that much more time. So I'd like to combine platforms and technology development, and not surprisingly, with the U.S. research fleet declining in size and number, and with ROVs, AUVs, and other instruments in high demand, the consensus of the forum was that we need more of those things and more access to those things. But there was also a very important discussion about technology development and the role that a national program of ocean exploration can play in encouraging technology development. And Rick, not surprisingly, I wonder if you could open the discussion on those 2 topics and share your thoughts here at MTS.
I'm all for it.
Excellent. Next.
Well, I mean, not to be too glib, but I think the only additional comment I'd make, and I'll say this a couple of times here today, I think, is the one of connectedness. That I think the good news is that exploration can be a vehicle, no pun intended, for some really incredible development on the platform side and on the technology side. But if it's viewed as developing the platforms and the technologies for exploration's sake, we're always going to be playing catch-up ball. And so how do we make this argument? And it's a little bit of the ships of opportunity argument as well, but it's a balance because you don't want to be subsumed. So when we put the Okeanos Explorer into action at NOAA, that was about just the opposite, saying we've got to have a dedicated resource. I'm not convinced that in this study we have adequately affirmed the need for that kind of dedicated resource. And so consequently, I think I'm sending a mixed message. We better integrate it, but at the same time, I think we need a stronger affirmation of the value of some of these dedicated resources.
Great. Please, Jerry.
I would just like to add to what Rick said. Many of us felt very strongly about the importance of a dedicated ship because it's a symbol of national leadership and all of those things. This was not something, though, that got as much broad support as we thought it might have. It was supported, but not as strongly as some other things. And we tried very hard to make this a report of the forum and not a report of what we thought should be in it. So there are a number of things that I regret.
Okay, I'm going to disagree with these guys now, to a certain extent, but probably win the hearts of a bunch of engineers if that's who we got in the audience. Because by 2020, I want to see us carrying out our first significant ship-free research. I think we're getting close to having that ability through telecommunications now. Telepresence is a wonderful thing. Earlier this year, I was actually, in the last month, I was actually able to help find a new vent site in the Caribbean from my basement, by actually having a ship stop. But I had to actually do that through the power of actual instant messaging, browbeating a watch leader on the ship to actually do the right thing and actually have them stop the ship and turn around and go back and look at something I just seen on the video field. But we're actually at the stage now, and this meeting is full of the technologies for that. We have AUVs and gliders that have long range and endurance in the oceans. We have autonomous surface vessels that can actually fly around that are solar powered, that can keep going and have long endurance at the surface. And we have satellites. And if you put the three together, there's no reason why somebody sitting right here on my phone here couldn't be redirecting an AUV somewhere in the Pacific interior right now. So we have the different components. So in fact, we're actually co-convening a Keck Institute of Space Studies, as it turns out, because that's where you can get the money from, to actually go and discuss this. We have a couple of fora starting next month in Pasadena, actually trying to pull that whole thing together of saying, how can you take satellite technology, autonomous vehicles, and mission scripting to actually try and work out how we could be doing this, because I've been doing this a long time now. We're talking about more than 50 expeditions in the last 25 years, and I'm not going to be going out to sea for another 25 years, and the oceans are still so hugely unknown. We need to come up with a paradigm shift of how do we do this an order of magnitude faster, and we can't afford 10 or 100 vessels of exploration. We need other stuff as well. Not to denigrate that we need ships of exploration, but we need a game changer, and I think it's available, and it's this audience. These are the people who are actually building those things. What we need now is the coherent framework of how to pull all that together.
And I agree. There's something, though, appealing about putting people at risk, and particularly some people. And I think from the public's perspective, that's part of it. And Shirley Pomponi was at our aquarium 2 nights ago, and she talked about this. You can do probably everything without having a person there. It's like going to the moon or something. But there's something about putting a human into the equation. So it's a combination of the two, and I would agree. I'll give you a list of people I'd like to put in. No.
In harm's way. But then but that should be the end game in telepresence, right? And I know David's been talking about this with what about how soon can we get to the virtual reality headset when you are there? Mm-hmm. You don't have to physically be there, but as far as your brain's concerned, you really are there. Mm-hmm. And it's coming for, I think it's at the level now. I mean, I'm just starting up a new program with NSF to actually do this with a bunch of early career scientists and their students. Is I know, because I've been doing it for a long time, that I can sit in my basement and I understand what's happening with a robot on the deep ocean floor. But that's because I'm steeped in the experience. Mm-hmm. So we still need the ships at the moment, because that's the way we educate people. It's how do we train people to understand these things so they get that better perception. And part of that is actually you come up with, and this is where you draw on science fiction. There was a great comedy show in the UK called Red Dwarf, and they had a game that had to be made illegal because it was called Better Than Life. Because you put on the headset and it was better than life, and nobody, the only way you could ever come out of it, if anyone ripped the headset off you, it was too traumatic. But if you were actually, the only way you could ever choose to leave, or the only way you could get out of the game was to choose to leave voluntarily. And people would waste away and die in the story because it was just too good. You wouldn't want to stop doing that. Yeah. And that's why I should never be allowed one of those headsets for the deep ocean, because I'd never come back.
That's a hard comment to follow. But yeah, I'll just insert one thing, and then Eric, and that is just an important comment to make, is that there was consensus among the participants that we needed to think about the world of ocean exploration technology more broadly than we traditionally do. It's not just ships and AUVs. It's observatories. It's landers. It's Argo floats, for that matter. It's satellites. It's everything. Looking at to create this picture that Chris is talking about, and trying to integrate that picture as we explore the oceans.
Something I didn't say that I should have said then is, of course, all that's great if you don't actually need any samples to work on. All this virtual reality stuff is great if you don't need samples. At the moment, we absolutely do need that. So then that's really, I think our community is making huge leaps in the vehicles and the capabilities to put things in the right place. But now we need to be able to make the measurements so we don't actually need to bring samples back to measure them. So that's really where there's a huge dearth right now, is the chemical and biological sensors as well as the physical sensors to understand the environment once we're there. Because if we can trip through that hurdle, then we really have cracked it. We actually then have a roadmap of how we can really do this thoroughly.
That's right. Yeah. Eric, you know something about technology, I think.
I've heard of it. Yeah. Yeah, this is exciting, and maybe this blends so well. Maybe I can kind of just blend this into the next topic, which I see in your computer, citizen exploration.
It is, and in fact, with the time we have left, that would be brilliant. Thank you.
All right, well, I'll do that.
Yeah.
So this is cool, and I want to just take a moment aside. I mean, from kind of the logical, this is how we can use these technologies, and just step back and think about how ridiculously awesome this period that we're in right now is. It is so cool that we right now have the technology to be able to explore the entire planet. I mean, really, with the keystroke of a computer, really. It's just astounding to me what now is not only accessible by institutions as far as research tools, but what, the kind of technology that's in everyone's pocket. Just the other month, we were in the lab, and a friend of mine got this thing called an Oculus Rift. It's kind of the virtual reality goggles of the 90s transformed into this very thin kind of thing that you wear, and you can't even see the boundary of the screen. So it really is kind of like that better than life thing. You look around and you're in another world. And I mean, of course, we're immediately diving into, God, how can we use this? Can we build an ROV that has cameras looking in every direction all at once and kind of synthetically stitch those together? Could you have one person flying an ROV, some kind of transecting type of fast ROV through a canyon underwater, and have a virtual school bus of kids where they're all wearing these things and they're able to kind of look around, and someone says, hey, what's that? And they turn the ROV. I mean, this is something that was science fiction just moments ago, and I think that when you talk about citizen exploration combined with platforms, that's really where things get amazing. Like I mentioned before, I think that the human element of exploration is particularly important when you want to get everyday people involved, because without the context of knowing what this pH level change significance is, without the context of this is the type of species you'd expect, but they're way further south this year and we don't know why, you really have to draw on just those things that are fascinating, and that's where we're at right now. So talking about platforms and particularly telepresence, I think that we have to do that right. Being able to get scientists involved and being able to log onto these missions and take part is important, but I'll bet you we can go even further. I think that the tools themselves can be kind of given to citizens. I'm trying not to just plug OpenROV, but as kind of an example, if I wanted a device that has extremely good processing power, I want it to have a camera and a compass and a gyroscope, let's see, maybe some GPS, I want to throw in some really good communication technology, and I want it to be like, this big, it's right here. So maybe we don't actually need to fund these large pieces of equipment from one place, but if we can just get out there ways for everyone to build their own equipment, then we can kind of crowdsource how that exploration is being done. And then one last thing I want to talk about is, you've noticed we're talking about citizen exploration. That's the term we're using here. At breakfast, actually, a few of us I think we discussed this briefly, that people are already kind of familiar with citizen science. That's a term that's been thrown around a lot, but some people kind of cringe when they hear it. They're nervous because people may not have the background to really do science. They don't have all the training and stuff necessary. But exploration just requires curiosity. It doesn't require necessarily a huge amount of a priori knowledge. And so I really think that's the right way to think about it, is get everyone involved. Just go explore and really kind of key into that human element of things.
Yeah, great, thank you. Now that we're deep into citizen exploration, or at least 100 meters deep into citizen exploration, Chris, as the facilitator of that session at the or the breakout session at the forum where that was such a hot topic, it was interesting. We had David Lang. We've talked about him quite a bit, the co-founder of OpenROV, going head to head with Paul Gaffney. Many of you know Vice Admiral Gaffney is a powerful intellect and force in ocean exploration, and not someone to back down from an argument. And watching David and Paul go at it head to head was not just entertaining, but really instructive. And I think they both changed each other's mind a little bit. So, and you were in the middle of that, trying to.
As the moderator, I thought it was instructive. I'm not sure I was entertained, so I'm just traumatized. But I think it is. I think that those discussions really helped clarify the whole thing of that's where we came from, with this whole idea of a citizen explorer being different from a citizen scientist. Mm-hmm. And I think a citizen scientist causes alarm on two levels. One is if you went out on the streets of San Diego today and said, "Hey, you interested in science?" You may get 20% take up, maybe. I'm being optimistic there because I'm a scientist. If you went out and said, "Hey, you interested in exploration?" It was like, "Hey, oh, cool, yeah." You probably get 80% take up. It's probably like a bit brain yin and yang thing. Exploration is something that can appeal to anybody on the street. Well, actually, yeah, if they're out on the street, they're probably not agoraphobic. There probably are people in society who say, "Are you interested in exploration?" It's like, oh, hell no, I just want to stay in my cupboard. But you wouldn't find them on the person on the street, so they wouldn't be represented in the poll anyway. But I think, so that's one side of it. If you say citizen explorer, everybody can understand exploring. It's just go somewhere different that you haven't been before. People can do that just by choosing what restaurant they're going to go to for lunch when they're on vacation. They get that. That's a very easy concept. The flip side of that is scientists and technologists who worry about, hey, citizen scientists, what are they going to do? Come in and start collecting my data. How am I going to know my data is of the right quality control? The kinds of things that scientists will immediately worry about of a citizen scientist. Whereas, can you make a first-order exploration? I think that's where the SETI analog comes in. But rather than it being your laptop that's doing it, it could be, how about humans just noticing, hey, there's something different there. That's as simple as it can be. Most of the ocean floor can be quite dull. It can take, there's an awful lot of hours that you put in to make the big discoveries. There's all the time you do, there's all the hours when you're not making the big discoveries before the big discoveries come through. But we only write the science and nature papers about the big discoveries. We don't write we don't write the long and worthy papers, or if we do, we don't get the publicity for it, and we don't get promotion based on all the worthy stuff that we do in between. That's actually what 80% of the science might be. So I think one analogy we have like that is when it comes to citizen explorers, I think there's two roles. One is, I love this idea of the magic school bus using the Oculus Rift, because it's not even the you're pointing the kids at the, hey, look at this. It can actually be, what about that stuff over there? And I've actually had experience. Kelly will actually remember that in the audience when we were on the Okeanos Explorer. I was getting really excited about some geology, and somebody was pointing out there were two new species that had never been seen in the same place anywhere on the planet before. In the same field of view, they were just getting in the way of the rock that I was trying to look at. But it was kind of handy having, at that time, I think there were 70 people screaming at me in Southampton, England, while I was out on a ship, and most of the people was getting relayed through the University of Rhode Island, pointing out that the observation I was making wasn't the important observation right then. Some other people had a better idea than I did. So there's that part of, like, in the moment, with the live teleconnection you can do that. But the second part of it is also, there's all the information that's been looked at. And so one of the ways we want to go in the future is going to be when you have machine recognition, you have video, computers that can actually wander through all the hours. We have half a century, just from Alvin alone, half a century of video of observations on the seafloor. Half the things we were observing at the time we didn't know were important at that point. I know a great analogy I have is deep sea corals are recorders of climate change in the deep ocean on very short timescales that are relevant to the post-industrial revolution impact, anthropogenic impact. There must be thousands of places around the planet where those things have been seen, but because that wasn't, the deep sea corals for the last half century were the gorilla in the room that Jerry was talking about earlier in this morning, that people were just driving past and ignoring. So we have all these records that there's no reason why they can't be made online. So people, again, this whole thing of like, some people like go with the highlights route. The Schmidt Ocean Institute did something different that I hadn't seen this summer, where when we were broadcasting our stuff live, they not only broadcast the stuff live, they made us interrupt the video feed every 4 hours, which is a huge inconvenience for the audience who were actually engaged at the time. But it meant they can actually leave the entire legacy of everything that was done is permanently embedded on YouTube now. So we really could, you know, there's a mechanism where you can not just stream it, but if you're not awake at 2 o'clock in the morning, you miss the highlight. You know, you miss the important things and you never know about it. There's a way that we can actually share this stuff, the Citizen Explorer approach, where we can actually turn around to people and say, if you want to sign up and become part of a Citizen Explorer club, here's things we'd like you to go. You know, can you go through here and just look for, you know, say it was a deep sea coral, a good analogy. You could actually put up some pictures and say, you don't have to recognize the species. I mean, you know, Tim Shanks in the audience, he's been out to sea with me. He knows he's taken me out and sat next to me for months on end. I still can't recognize the species, but I can tell it from a rock or mud, you know. And so that first order level, and if I can turn around and tell Tim, okay, here's the 10% of all the places where I saw any coral today, that means he doesn't have to look at the other 90%. You know, somebody who can actually bring the real high value science can come to that. And, you know, a person, you know, a lay person can actually do an awful lot of the useful stuff and make a useful contribution, you know, and it's a really important, significant contribution. It's not trivial what that would achieve.
Great. So I think I'd like to pause here. We have two other topics that are explored in the report. One is on data management, data sharing, and sort of making the case that at least for publicly funded expeditions, all data should be available as soon as possible to anyone who wants it. That's, you know, the basic premise. And then of course, once you start to drill down on that proposition, there were more and more questions that would come up, like, you know, well, what if I want to keep my data for a couple of years and, you know, under certain circumstances and all that kind of stuff. But the basic principle was free and open sharing of data is very important to a national program. And of course, the importance of engaging the public in new and innovative ways. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next session. Some of us are involved in telepresence, which is either, I guess, a couple doors down. But I'd like to pause there. We've got 15 minutes left. We do have copies of the report. Before we hand them out, I'd like to say a couple words about what we do next, and then invite all of you to ask our panel questions. So we have already planned for, we're not calling it Ocean Exploration 2021, but for the next National Forum, we'll probably be at the aquarium, the National Aquarium in Baltimore in maybe September of next year. And so we're already planning for that event and thinking hard about what we need to do between now and then to make that forum a successful one. So from the NOAA perspective, we know we need to do what we can to maintain the energy level that was in the forum, and it was impressive. Part of it generated by all of Jerry's visitors at the aquarium, but also the enthusiasm of the ocean explorers who was there was palpable, and we need to husband that and move it forward. But there are some concrete things we need to do as well. We hope to be able to partner with OpenROV to host a summit on citizen exploration. Again, to spin up the energy in the community, but also to start to look at questions about mechanisms, about data quality, about how someone with one of these robots diving on a particular transect in Monterey Bay, for example, can upload that data and have it useful to sanctuary managers. Questions like that start to be practical questions and are questions best addressed in Silicon Valley, if you ask me, because that's kind of what they do for a living. So that's one activity. We also would like to learn more about the priorities of other institutions that are engaged in ocean exploration, the Schmitz, the Ocean Exploration Trust, the academic institutions, Scripps, Mabari, Woods Hole, and many others who are involved, and start to compile that into a record that anyone can look at and see where the major institutions are going. And probably one or two other things that will help us sort of define and characterize the nature of the national program between now and then. So in just maybe a few seconds each, may I ask each of the panelists to identify one thing that we need to do between now and next September when we have the second forum to show that we paid attention to this report and are positioned to advance the national agenda in ocean exploration. And I'd like to start with Jerry, if I may.
I think all of us who were involved need to keep this whole concept in play and refine it. But I think the #1 job, without which we're all wasting our time is that NOAA leadership has to say ocean exploration is a priority. Not the only priority, but if it's not a priority, then we're wasting our time.
I think the single thing I would say is implement this. And that means, you know, a year from now, it's 1/7 of the distance to 2020. So we should have all the top-ranked stuff checked off, or at least have started working on these things. So we need to actually make some progress and actually see that the report isn't just a lot of, you know, it's a glossy report, but it's got to be something that gets acted on as well. And a year from now, I'd like to see a progress report of like, okay, who's done what on some of these things.
We'll ask you that same question.
Two things, just to put an emphasis on what Jerry just said. If it's a national program, it has to be a national priority. So that's easily said, hard to implement, I think. But the other thing that I think would be very easy to implement is to build some hybrid vigor into this. And what's going through my mind is that we're very good at talking to ourselves and among ourselves. And there, for example, are a couple of communities that explore, but not in the way that we think about it. So the nano and microtechnologies communities and all the electron microscopy that they do is a form of exploration. Could we bring some of them in? The biomedical community, with all of its diagnostic capabilities, have developed some incredible ways of looking at images. I think bringing in, having a little bit of thought about what some of those other communities are that we might want to bring in, whom we don't think of necessarily as the sort of exploration communities, but really they are doing a form of exploration. Could we get some cool ideas from those communities and build some hybrid vigor into the discussion?
Great.
Yeah, and I agree with Rick. I think a lot of times the results that are reached are kind of a result of who's in the room. And so getting the most diverse group possible, I think, is really important. You get different perspectives. And then also what Chris said, try it out. You know, it's all talk until you actually do it. And then a lot of times once you start doing it, you realize, well, here's some aspects that need to be considered more and so on. So I'd love to see at least the beginning steps of implementing these already kind of underway so we can see how they're doing and where the results are coming from.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. Now, questions. Drew, you had your hand up first. Yeah, please use the microphone so the webcast.
Thanks for putting together such a great panel. It's very interesting. I'm Drew Stevens with Esri. We're a GIS platform provider. I've been tweeting and texting about the panel, so I think there's a lot more people watching online than are in the room, which is great. The first, I'm going to a paraphrase from Guy Knoll, retired NOAA captain, now with Esri's Ocean Initiative. He's asking, how can we help explain to people far from the ocean about the importance of ocean exploration? And I'll add to that, you know, in Boulder, Colorado, there's the Colorado Ocean Consortium, I think it's called, and they're making great news in the middle of the continent, realizing that half of the oxygen they're breathing in the Rockies is coming from the oceans. So with that in mind, I'll follow up with, how do we help ocean exploration become as popular as space exploration? It's still a planet.
Can I start? I think that's a great question, and it's definitely something that we think a lot about when we're trying to build these devices that everyone can use to explore. You know, ROVs are great for exploring the ocean, but obviously they're useful for going into lakes and ponds and things like that, which may actually have some data that is relevant to what happens in the ocean, but also they give kind of people a concept that there's stuff that's below the waves in water. You know, we've already talked about telerobotics and being able to log on to things in other places. I think being able to actually interact with something is a lot different than just seeing it from a place where you can't control. If you're able to explore coral reef remotely and you know where that hermit crab always used to hang out and one day it's gone, that impacts you in a different way than just seeing photos. Answering or kind of relating to your second question about how do we make it as interesting as the space program, that is, I think that's a huge question. It's a really important question. I've spent a lot of time thinking about it. I used to do stuff involving spacecraft design. And you know, there's a few elements I think that really get people's attention about spaceflight. One is the rocket launch, right? It's this thing where you're kind of loosely familiar with what's supposed to happen. There's this element of suspense. and this kind of excitement when it goes right. And then there's this wonder. Anyone from anywhere in the world can look at a dazzling night sky and be mesmerized by that. And it's much harder to do that when all you can see is waves. And if you're inland, you can see waves on a television screen or in a photograph. So I think bringing those elements together where people aren't just involved with looking at what's there as like point blank, this is what's there, but being involved in the process, saying, okay, this ship is launching from is leaving this port on this day, and this is their mission. In 2 weeks, they're planning to be at the bottom of this underwater trench, and we think that we're going to find this. So will it happen? And that kind of suspense and build up, and really bringing people along for the journey. That's how you get the kind of excitement, the story, not just the ending.
I want to weigh in also, and I think that it feeds nicely on Eric's comment. The problem with the space example is that if you use, say, the period of the 60s as the golden age, there was no competition. There was only one thing happening. We were going to the moon. There weren't 5 people trying to do this. And what I see, I'm looking at Scott Glenn in the back there, and so you take the Scarlet Knight transit across the Atlantic. That was a really outstanding example that needed even more visible global attention. It was one of probably 5, 6, 7 activities. You know, we just heard Chris's great story of discovery from his basement of what's going on out in the middle of the ocean. Why can't we stop being in this competitive mode, which is why we're not a good comparison with the space example, and dedicate ourselves to saying, you know what, we're going to nationally focus on a couple of these things, maybe in sequence. So this month, the miracle of the month is going to be the AUV going across the Atlantic. The miracle of next month is going to be this cruise in the Banda Sea. The miracle of the next month, and agree that everybody gets some of that limelight. But right now, what we're doing is dividing that limelight into 12 little pencil lights around the country.
Time for a question, or are you still answering that, Chris?
I'd like to carry on answering that question, if that's okay.
And then you're next. Yeah.
But so I have 2 answers to it. The short answer is, which is not my idea, but I thought it was really eloquent when somebody came up with this in Long Beach in July, was we need to get a country and western song about this stuff that'll get airplay in the landlocked states away from the oceans. Because that kind of convened of, like, you know, I think it was Paddy Fryer had a brilliant thing from a New Yorker cartoon of, like, you know, society ladies sitting around having an afternoon tea reception saying, I don't know why I don't care about the oceans, I just don't. But it's that thing of, like, how do you get across to the broad population? And there's a whole demographic who won't be paying attention to this and won't be reading the press releases about this stuff. So that kind of crystallized that for us, of just like just said, I think at some point that was it. I've been reporting saying we had a wonderful diversity of people engaged on our Google Hangout, and then somebody turned around and said, yeah, you didn't. You had a bunch of nerds who care about the oceans, which is a tiny subset of the population. But the flip side of that, I think, is then how do you actually bring that, you know, how do we do a better job? And the answer is, you know, the way I'd phrase it is we need professional help. We need to seek professional help because we're ocean scientists and we're not professionals in these areas. So that's something that I'm pursuing now, is actually to work out, well, how do we go find the social scientists who care about these things? How do we go and find people who actually already know how to do remote conveying and communication? And how do we go find professional educators who just know how do we take the wonderful technologies that Eric's come out, you know, the Oculus Rift, you know, you can bring this stuff to the classroom. I've read, there's been a bunch of essays this year in the field of geology saying students engage a lot better in the classroom if you can just take them out and let them wander around an outcrop. Mm-hmm. Go look at some rocks, take them out to a road cutting or a construction site, you know, or a quarry, and just actually let them get their hands on rocks and things like that. And their grade point average goes up about 0.5 in that field. And you can't take people out and throw them in the bottom of the ocean. You know, their parents complain. But maybe there is this way to do that. And then the question is, okay, we have the technology, we've got the smarts intellectually, we know how to go do that stuff, we know what the story is. We're not necessarily professional educators. Then it's how do you take that into a meaningful experience? Because there probably is, you know, there's no reason why every classroom in the Midwest couldn't be routinely visiting the ocean as part of their education, as part of their science classes in high schools, middle schools. You know, they could be doing all that stuff. But we're probably not the people to come up with what the meaningful educational program is, you know. But there's a whole vast planet of expertise out there in other fields that we need to marry up to this.
Okay. Just quickly, and then we'll take the question.
So I need to add to this. So it's the story, stupid. I get that. The question is, how do you deliver it? The problem with classrooms is that, first of all, the curriculum is so jam-packed, and we're driven by standards. It's true that the next generation science standards are better than the forerunners, but they're still restrictive, and if you look at how much time there is in the curriculum and the extent to which the ocean is covered, while we're changing that, this nation has a network of museums and science centers and even aquariums, and in the aggregate, they attract more people than all professional sports teams combined. We don't have the scientific expertise, but we have people who are experts in packaging and delivering stories to the general public. We need to partner with the experts so we get the story right, and we're wholesalers in information. So I would like to see that partnership, and we are not constrained by standards. I just am part of an NSF study that's just coming out, and I wrote an essay for it, and the title was "The Joy of Living a Life Devoid of Standards." Well, they wouldn't let me use that, of course, but there is a wonderful thing about not being constrained by meeting standards. You want kids to explore, to discover, to ask stupid questions, to fall down and pick themselves up. That's what exploration is about. That's what science is about. And we are so constrained in the classroom that we take these natural-born explorers and we no.
Okay. Okay. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Khaki Flynn. Chris, you may have answered this. Your accent's a little fast for my southern accent, so sorry. So the debate, a big question that's come up this week is, we want people to go on the ocean. We either have ROVs built, or we pay 40 grand a day to get people out there, and it's really hard to get citizens out. But what if we had somebody who said, hey, I'm going to be the Henry Ford of ocean exploration, and make that inexpensive and get people out there, make it safe and accessible, and you own a submersible you're just as likely to own that as a car. I mean, it's the world population is what on the coast? Isn't it the majority of the world's population is on the coastlines? And so that seems like a doable thing. And so what are your guys' thoughts on that? Like getting, Toyota to build submersibles, or some other, or get Elon Musk to take the Hyperloop and bring that into the ocean?
Go,
I think that's a great idea. Someone ought to do that.
Somebody should do it.
I mean, that's certainly what we're trying to do with Open ROV. We've got this ROV that can go to 100-meter depth, and you can get live high-definition video and drive it around, and it costs the same as a fancy, DSLR camera. It's under $1,000, and we're trying to make it cheaper. But there's also this kind of practical issue of access beyond the breakwater. You have to kind of get a boat to get out into, when we're talking about ocean. Lakes and ponds, of course, that's an easier case. Every once in a while, these things just kind of dawn upon me when I'm in a conversation with something of like, oh God, I guess you could just do that. And something that someone pointed out, because they were telling me how they've done this sometimes for whale watching, I think, you can just go to a fishing town and hire a fisherman to take you out to sea. You can just do that. It's not terribly expensive, especially if you get a bunch of your buddies going with you. And so, I think about, dive boat charters. There are all these dive boats that will take you out scuba diving. And like you say, if you can get a tool in the hands of everyday people, where just kind of for fun, as an excuse to get outside, they can be brought, 20 miles offshore or something, and just throw something overboard. How awesome would that be? How cool would that be? And then it's not a research grant. It's just people who are doing this for fun. And kind of relates to what we were talking about earlier. I think some of the best education happens outside of the classroom. Mm-hmm. You want school kids to learn about underwater. Well, okay, I'd give you a grade, maybe a B+ if you can get them to learn about underwater when they're in the classroom. But I'd give you an A or an A+ if you can make it so they go home after school and log on and learn about the ocean that way because they want to. That's even better. And aquariums and places like that are really the thing that does that the best. So yeah, I think there's a huge potential there, and like I said before too, even video games. I mean, I did these LAN parties when I was a kid where we'd all bring our computers into one spot and kind of interact. I picture going out on this kind of research vessel that's sort of like a dive boat, but no one gets in the water. You just have this array of computers, and you're there with like 6 of your buddies, and you're all logging in this this kind of lander goes down to the bottom, and from it deploys these 6 ROVs, and everyone's driving around, and someone's like, oh, look, there's a rock over here, everyone check this thing out, there's this cool little, and everyone drives around. I mean, that's fun. You don't need to tell me to do that in a classroom. I'm going to do it because I want to. And anyway, I'm excited. But yes, that is an awesome idea in my opinion.
Great. In the back of the room, please. And then.
Hi, I'm Scott Glenn from Rutgers. I usually ask a question about inspiring the students. I don't need to ask that this time. I want to ask a question about inspiring my students' parents. I'm avoiding the careers talk right now to be here. And so on page 30, we have exploration drives innovation, innovation drives economic growth. I'd like to talk more about the workforce side of it, because the citizen side science is great. Really support that. But that's amateurs. When we have them in college, we have them for that 4 years, their parents want to know where they're going. And when you look at the paid explorers, they're still considered a bit elitist. And if you look around this room, we don't look like America. And so I want some inspiration on that I could relay to my students' parents this time. Thank you.
You want to go first, Jerry? You going to give it a stab?
I think that's a very, very important question, because it's reflected in where we're failing in STEM fields as a nation. If you look at the pipeline of youngsters that are going into getting interested in science, technology, engineering, and math, and it's not seen by much of what is now America as a pathway to a successful career. And they would rather be a basketball star in the NBA or something. We somehow have to make it clear that there are a lot of different fields within which scientists, engineers, technologists, they don't all have to be professors or work for NOAA. So there's a range of careers that we have done a poor job, and we need some heroes. There was a program in Florida, and I've forgotten what city it is, where they actually took ads out on buses and at bus stops and to try to make the kids from poorer communities aware of science and the excitement. I think we have to do something like that. And again, I would come back to, I think museums and science centers and aquarium can help, because in our institution, for example, about 60% of the people who come are parents or grandparents with children. And the dominant cluster are Hispanic. And here's a case where the kids are often educating the parents because the parents may not speak English. There's a wonderful dynamic that takes place, and we have to work harder, though, at giving them the information that they need, that there are opportunities and there are jobs. And then I think it comes back also to the classroom. And you know, the ocean is not in the standards, so we got a lot of work to do. But I agree, it's really a very important challenge.
And I could answer it. I mean, I think your question was from an economic perspective as well. So Rick was talking about that earlier on in terms of, I think he touched on both health and security, but there's also resources as well. Now, going back to this point of half of America is underwater. Then, from a geological perspective, a couple of things that I'm aware of that are increasing. We know with the hydrocarbon industry, people have moved further and further into deep water and how to actually operate in the deep ocean. So now that infrastructure, a lot of those core engineering problems have been solved. There are other ways that can expand out. So, for example, a lot of people worry about climate change, are worried about methane release from gas hydrates. That if the oceans warm up, the seafloor gets warmer, you destabilize those systems. A chief executive of a hydrocarbon company should be getting a lot smarter about that and turn around and saying, well, how about we go and meaningfully extract that stuff and get that methane for free, that high-grade ore? And then we can eliminate having to worry about fracking in Midwest, because we can get a cheap access. There's things that are available out there. There's an industry that could happen. In the same way, everyone who drives a hybrid car and cares about the planet now needs a lot more copper than they ever needed to for the electrical wiring in those cars compared to a conventional car. We need a lot more copper. Now, one of those options is you can go and start doing strip mining in your backyard or somebody else's backyard, or maybe those things sit on the seafloor. Every extinct hydrothermal system sitting on the seafloor is a very high-grade sulfide deposit You know, we know of processes in our EEZ in the, off the coast of Oregon and Northern California. There's an area there where there's a very efficient process where there are sediments capping these very high-grade metal ores. You know, there are things to be had. So it doesn't have to be purely esoteric. I mean, I'm going to go and explore because I want to, and, you know, if there was a biologist sitting here or a Navy expert, you know, they could sit and wax lyrical about where the opportunities arise from the biological and life and medical sciences, or where they arise from the strategy from defense. But I think that's, you know, we're probably not getting those messages across either, that, you know, it doesn't have to be purely, and it's very heartfelt, my response, because I went to college to train as a chemical engineer, and I decided I was going to become a geologist halfway through, and I had to phone my dad up and have that conversation of why this was an okay thing to do. And he left school at 14 in World War II to be an apprentice in the local naval dockyard. You know, I'd grown up and never wanted to go to sea. I knew what his life had been and didn't want to be doing that. Never wanted to go near the ocean. I just wanted to go and, you know, work for DuPont or something like that. And suddenly, halfway through, I had to turn around and explain why it was okay to go off and follow something that seemed a bit more fanciful, and reassure him, no, there's good hardcore, you know, there's good avenues here, good prospects to be doing this stuff.
So we need some role models like Eric and David Lang. You're guys, they took a different career trajectory, and now you're what, Fortune 100 company?
Almost.
All right, so we've gone over our time by quite a bit. One more question, and then we should close. So other.
Hi, I'm Marie Roach from San Diego State and Scripps. There's a lot of things you guys are talking about that I'd love to ask you about, but I'm going to restrict myself to this one question. You talked a little bit about data information, and, you know, one of the things that concerns me is with the high bit rates that we're now getting, there's an awful lot of data out there. There's a lot of mandates that we're supposed to archive this data, to put it in ways to preserve it, and that's a wonderful, wonderful thing. But there's usually not any money behind that mandate. And when you talk to people about basically being able to get the infrastructure to support that, the money's not there. And given the value of this data, and if we want to look at things at decadal timescales, we really need to be preserving this. And I think we need to be doing something more than saying, well, you know, this is something that Silicon Valley has to understand. I'm just wondering about your opinion on that.
So very quickly, this is obviously a topic that transcends any number of areas, and there's been some really creative thinking of late. And I would counterbalance your argument by saying that one of the areas that has the largest bit rate, if you will, is the entertainment industry. And the money is there. It's on a subscription basis. So you're willing to pay $9.99 to iTunes to download a rather large volume of information just for your pleasure. The questions come up that perhaps we need to think about new models and paradigms for how we handle the data. Not the access and the archive, but the use of it. And there has to be to some extent, a pay-as-you-go basis for doing that. So it's ill-formed, but people are basically saying, we can't operate on this open source concept completely. There's going to have to be some accountability for who's using the data.
And I think the National Weather Service does a pretty good job of transforming data into informational products that we all use, and we get them on the evening weather forecast. I think some other parts of NOAA could do a much better job, and I would agree with you. It seems to me it has to become an important part of the budget, that it is for creating a portfolio of products that will be useful to different user groups. And user fees are fine, but if the informational products aren't there in the first instance, user fees don't work.
Okay.
And I think just the last thing is that I had on that was just making the implementation happen, making it easy, which means spoon-feeding the public, being able to how they can get access to the data, spoon-feeding explorers to make it easy to share the data. And I think, you know, at the forum there was a widespread consensus. In principle, everybody loved the idea of making the data available easily and making it readily accessible. But how do we do that? And, you know, the people who are doing the exploration aren't necessarily the smartest people to be doing that kind of stuff, or the best equipped, and it's not the best use of their time. You know, there's other ways we'd like to have them. So if we actually had a seamless thing, and that's going to require resources as well. You know, that's another one of these things where we need this plea for professional help or an intervention. And I think your point is exactly right. It needs resources to make that happen as well, and resources channeled at the right kind of people. And, you know, the analogy with the entertainment industry is very valid. You know, you shouldn't necessarily pour that money into oceanographers to make data accessible to the public.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. We're a bit over time, but thank you all for staying. I think these guys will probably stay around for a few minutes before the next session. And again, thank you for your time and for your participation. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you.